Hello readers, I'm the Avid Reader, and today we're reviewing The Man in the High Castle, written by Philip K. Dick in 1962. So this is one of the oldest alternative history books. It's one of the most popular ones. You could say it's one of the pioneers in the alternative history scenario in what if the Nazis won World War II. And as this is Philip K. Dick, a sci-fi author, there's also a bunch of sci-fi in this. And the plot of the story is basically what if the Nazis and the Japanese, the Axis powers, won World War II. And before I continue, there will be spoilers in this review. The United States has been conquered by Japan and Nazi Germany. In the east, you've got the Nazi United States. In the west, you've got the Japanese Pacific states. And in the middle, you've got the mountain states, which is a neutral zone. The Japanese aren't that bad as governors, even if it's an empire, while the Nazis are horrible and have committed genocides and things like that. And it's a totalitarian state, so Nazi Germany is a totalitarian state, while Japan is a very liberal state for an empire, which is kind of weird in this book. So we get a lot of perspectives in this book, and most of them are in the Pacific states of America, and then you also get one in the mountain states, I think. One of the first characters we meet is Robert Childan, and he's an antique store owner. And here it's a weird thing, since the Japanese are really nostalgic for old American things, so they like to buy old things that are American. And it's 1962 now, so they like buying things from the 30s and before. And someone visits his store, is going to buy a gun for a so-called high-ranking Japanese admiral, but then he analyzes it and says it's a fake. And Sheldon makes some calls, and it turns out he's got some fake goods in his antique store without being aware of it. And this was caused because of Frank Frink. Frank Frink, he's a Jewish American guy who becomes a jeweler later on after he's been fired from his company, and he opens this jewelry thing with his co-partner and they start making jewelry. But he also made some racket by producing fake goods which he arranged in his previous company to being sold to antique owners, and this hurts the antique owners' reputation from the Japanese. So Japanese authorities are trying to clamp down on this counterfeit goods. The highest ranking character we get to see is Mr. Tagomi, and he's a Japanese trade official in the Pacific states of America. And he is to meet someone who is called Baines, who is from Sweden, some industrialist. And he bought something from the antique store to better relations with the Swede. And in Nazi Germany, there you've had Chancellor Bormann, who's been running things as Hitler has gone insane. And the Nazis, they've sent rockets into space, so Baines travels in a rocket to the United States very quickly. And it's a very advanced society, the Nazi United States, so a lot of people have moved there to get some good work. Yeah, so a lot of socialism in the Nazi stuff, so that's a bit weird. In the mountain states, you've got Juliana Frink, is the ex-wife of Frank Frink, and she can defend herself, and she meets this trucker called Joe Sinadella. She goes with him to a motel, they sleep together, and they wanna visit the man in the high castle who wrote a book called The Grasshopper. And The Grasshopper is an alternative history book. What if the Allies won World War II instead of the Axis? And it basically projects that the British are going to dominate the world, I think, and that they are treating anyone else horribly. So it assumes that the Allies would have been just as bad and just as genocidal as the Axis powers. And Joe Sinadella wants to go visit the man in the high castle. And at the motel he reveals that he's a Swiss assassin who's been sent to kill this Abenson, because this thing is banned in Nazi Germany and Nazi occupied territory. It's not good for the Nazis that they have some rivalry literature. Back in Nazi Germany, Chancellor Martin Bormann, he dies, so there's a rivalry of who's going to get the chancellorship, the real power. So Tagomi meets with some other Japanese officials and discusses who's going to get the power. And Goebbels becomes chancellor, Goering becomes chief of police. There's thought that Heydrich might be whacked. It's thought that Heydrich is behind the death of Himmler in 1947. There's also some moral ambiguity we'll later see in this novel. And it turns out that when Baines meets Mr. Tagomi and some Japanese general, Mr. Baines reveals that he is Rudolf Wegener, and this guy is a Jew. There's a lot of secret Jews in Nazi Germany in high-ranking positions. He reveals that the Nazis are planning Operation Dandelion, which is a plan to attack the Japanese Empire by the Nazis and then wipe it out. And Goebbels favors this plan and Heydrich is opposed to this. So Heydrich, who runs the horrible SSSD police, and the SS is the horrible ones who committed genocide and things like that, they are actually kind of good guys here because they don't want to go to war with Japan. So yeah, moral ambiguity. And keep in mind, all of these changes is just because Roosevelt was shot in 1933. So there was a bunch of lame duck presidents who came after him, and that's why the United States was conquered. So this alternative history plot is not very plausible, but that's not what's interesting with this story. The interesting part is the culture in the United States under Nazis and under the Japanese. And at this meeting between the three, the general, the German, and Tagomi, a few SD men come and attack the office where they work at, and Tagomi shoots a couple of them with his antique gun, and he is distressed by this, so he starts becoming kind of crazy while he walks the streets. And he meets with Councillor Russ, and he reprimands him for what he did. And Frank Frink was arrested for his crime of stealing counterfeit goods. And as he's a Jew, he's going to be turned over to the Nazis, but Mr. Tagomi annuls this. Councillor Russ is not happy with this uncivil style. And Joe Cinnadella wants Juliana to come over to the High Castle to get Abensen to drop his guard. She refuses. They argue and she cuts his throat with a razor. She leaves. He bleeds out, so he's the only one who actually dies in this book of the major characters. And she meets the man in the High Castle who wrote The Grasshopper, Abensen. And she meets his wife also, and she's asking him of the grasshopper and what it means and how he wrote it. And he reveals that he's being able to write this through an oracle. There's a talk about oracles and a bunch of Asian mystic stuff, so that makes this book confusing. There are a lot of pages where you don't really understand anything, and this is Philip K. Dick and his crazy sci-fi sometimes writing in this, so not only alternative history. So Juliana learns that The Grasshopper is written by this oracle thing, kind of predicted, and it's a predicted future alternative history where the Allies might have won, kind of in a parallel universe maybe. And then she just leaves the house, which isn't the High Castle. He's moved away from it and he doesn't care if he's going to get killed. And that's how the story ends. And back in Germany, Rudolf Wegener, or Mr. Baines, has traveled back there and he's taken away by some SS men, taking him to Heydrich, so he knows he's not going to get killed. And Heydrich is probably going to undertake a coup against Goebbels, which is going to prevent Operation Dandelion and also prevent the invasion of Japan. So that's the story in a nutshell. So how would I rate The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick? I would give it a 7 out of 10. Now for alternative history, I did not love this book. Alternative history, and I've read mostly from Harry Turtledove, it can be really interesting, really good, and often very plausible. This book is not plausible at all, you could say. It shows several interesting points, but I think it presents the Japanese as two light rulers. I don't think they would liberalize as it is described here. I mean, if you look at historically in World War II, the Japanese treated the Chinese almost as badly as the Nazis treated the Slavs, probably worse. The only worst thing was the treatment of the Jews maybe, so I don't think the Japanese would be as positive as is presented in this book. And of course it's unrealistic that the Axis would have won and taking over America. That makes no sense really, even if America did not join World War II. But that's not really my problems with this book. My problem is you've got a bunch of Philip K. Dick, whoopsie, weird sci-fi things that you don't understand, some mystic Asian things. I also would have liked to get a character perspective in the Nazi-occupied area, since when you're reading about the Nazis winning World War II, you want to read their perspective also, not just the Japanese, so most of the information we get is from the Japanese side. And also, this book kind of abruptly ends and the meeting in the High Castle, it's not that great, kind of feels underwhelming. It's very short for a book, I would say, so it feels rushed the last few dozen pages, and some of the scenes are mystique and they don't really make sense. It should have been longer, and I would have preferred that he removed the craziest kind of sci-fi stuff with the mysticism and the oracle and things like that. Maybe he could have turned it like Turtledove or Crichton or someone else who makes it much clearer. If this book had been written clearer, it would have been better. And if it was a bit of a longer alternative history book, it would also have been better. So that's my rating, 7 out of 10. It's a decent book. You should read it. It's interesting to get the perspective of this, but it's not only alternative history. If you want a great book on what if the Nazis won World War II, I would recommend Fahrenheit. That's realistic, that perspective kind of. It's much better written, I would say. It's longer, so you get more meat. So, this was the avid reader's review of The Man in the High Castle, written by Philip K. Dick in 1962. It got a 7 out of 10. I hope you readers enjoyed this book review, and I will see you readers next time.